Pam Isfeld, president of ASO. Oh, and I talk over the recording thing. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue to this session of the third session, pardon me, of our second annual Tradecraft conference. I am hosting this meeting from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and I acknowledge and respect them as the past, present, and future guardians and caretakers of these lands. I am very pleased to have a return guest. Dr. Jamey Essex. Professor Essex is a professor at the University of Windsor in the Political Studies Department, and he has done the thing that is guaranteed to endear him to a whole group of people by studying us. I know that your primary research interest has been in official development assistance over the years, but a few years ago, as most of our people here, I think we've got mostly return visitors here. No, you started looking at the, what were we called back then? Foreign Affairs and International Trade Canada and CETA merger. When we created GAC and all of the issues that created for culture and how we do all kinds of things. So I think this is your, third time with us? I know you came to talk to us.
Yeah. I was here last year at this time, and then I did one sort of breakfast speaker series thing before that.
Yep,
so,
when we found you on
my welcome may be wearing out.
Yes. No, your welcome is definitely not wearing out, but this presentation is going to be a little bit different, I think, right? Talking about how hardship is assessed with different foreign services. So yeah, I will shut up and let you talk. And just to warn everyone, we are recording. Since there's only a few folks, how do you prefer to do questions? Do you want to see people pop up their hand in kind of hot pursuit, or would you rather wait at the end?
Yeah, Marty and I were talking about that. I mean, I have a presentation. The slides are not anything to write home about. They're sort of text. It's more for me, guiding me so I don't go way off topic. Yeah, we can do hands, or people can put questions in the chat. I have that sort of open on the side here, and I can see all the participants, attendees. So yeah, and I can answer questions along the way, or we can save them till the end, however you guys want to do it.
Well, how about I will keep an eye on the chat and just see if there is anything that's really sort of hot pursuit that, would make sense to stop you for. But otherwise, maybe we'll wait to the end. And then, I can offer participants the chance to be promoted to panelist to come up and talk if they want, or you can use the Q&A thing or the chat thing. Okay. One small thing, I'll ask people not to use the Q&A thing for comments. I've noticed a couple times people have done that in other webinars, and it just gets confusing because then it makes everyone, be looking for everything all over the place. So if you have a comment, put it in the chat. If you have a question, put it in the Q&A, and we will also make sure we pick up on questions in the chat too. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Yeah, it becomes a bit like watching cable news or something, right? Like there's a scroll at the bottom and people on screen. Yeah. So can you guys hear me okay? Like the sound is fine?
All good from my end.
Okay, good. Here, I'll share my screen just so I can sort of roll through the slides. Like I said, it's mostly text. I don't think it's nothing on here too crazy. I had some images, but I didn't think that they were going to be that useful. So yeah, I'm going to talk about hardship in different rotational foreign services. I mean, my main focus has been Canada, and now increasingly the US as well. And I'll get into sort of why that is with a couple of examples. So just to give everyone a bit of background on what I'm doing and how I got to be here. You can see the screen that says larger research project? Yep, okay. Yes, so as Pam mentioned, I've been working on this for a while. I had a SSHRC grant from 2016 to 2020, which was extended into 2021 by the pandemic. But I started before that in 2015. I was looking particularly at the amalgamation that brought CETA and DFATE under one roof in what's now called Global Affairs Canada. My particular interest in the merger was how it was changing people's sort of day-to-day work, their professional identities, how they thought of themselves as development officers, as foreign service officers, and what it meant for sort of organizing expertise and skills in global affairs Canada. This was building off some previous work I had done on USAID in the US context, their relationship with the State Department, their sort of internal organization, the way it shaped policy thinking. And I draw quite a bit on another geographer. I'm in the political science department, but my background's all in geography, political geography and geopolitics. She's at UBC on the West Coast, Maria Koos. She's done quite a bit of work on diplomacy in the EU context, and she's written quite a bit about this. She talks about the what she calls the diffuse and internally differentiated workings of transnational institutional fields, sort of these bodies of expertise and practice that we call diplomacy or development, and how they function over time, how people are sort of professionalized into them, the way people think of themselves as sort of national and transnational agents working in the diplomatic field. So that sort of shaped the way I've approached a lot of the work over the last few years. And practically, I was really interested in talking to people. So I ended up over those few years doing more than 80, I think it ended up being about 85, 86 interviews with people working at Global Affairs Canada, FS, PM, EC, some consular officers, a few people in the EX level, but not many, because I was more interested in the sort of working level, day-to-day operations, people's career trajectories and things like that. Just thinking about, how does this institutional change shape the way that they do their work? And I say they, but I'm talking about you. So, how does it change sort of professional identity? How do they think about the role of diplomacy in relation to development? And yeah, initially I had done so much work on development, and then as I got into it, I've shifted more toward looking at foreign services, right? And this is the diplomacy side of foreign service political stream. Let me figure out, I got too many windows open. There we go. So I have published some, some published pieces so far. I mean, these are all in academic journals. And as Pam said, I've spoken to PAFSO audiences a couple of times. So the four main things that we've had published, and I have another one that's sort of languishing, I'll talk about in a minute. The first one was sort of built from early work, looking at development expertise in particular in the merger in the Canadian geographer. Another piece in political geography on diplomatic labor and sort of the institutional culture and state work. And then I got a little bit more into PAFSO kind of side of things, looking at just sort of the history of PAFSO and collective bargaining. The one I think I talked about before, I think I gave a presentation on this for you guys, the one about what people wear to work, that seemed to generate a lot of interest because it just came up through lots of different things. I mean, that's published in a feminist journal of politics on work culture and dress, how people dress for work, and how it's sort of a signal of institutional affiliation amid this sort of churn with the amalgamation over time. And then the most recent piece, which is sort of informing what I'm going to talk about today, about rotationality and hardship, because I have become much more interested as I go forward past the Shirk grant and into a new set of questions about the sort of international presence. I mean, about half of GAC's people are overseas. That happens in a lot of foreign services where people are moving in these sort of rotational systems. And particularly the idea of how you assess hardship, risk, danger in the diplomatic context, right? With a very large overseas network of people and sites and people moving around all the time. And I frame that as, looking at examples, the green zone, the sort of Baghdad green zone in the US embassy there as an example, Havana syndrome, which I'll come to in a minute, just sort of as a first cut, because there hasn't been a lot of work on this in geography. There's a group of people who are doing stuff on diplomacy from a variety of approaches, but very few have talked about sort of hardship as a condition of work, right? A way that the networks of movement and expertise and how corporate manages people and stuff moving around, like how hardship sort of shapes that. So that's what I'm interested in now. And my co-author on that, I mean, he was at Carleton for a while. I think he's sort of taken a break from his PhD. He was my research assistant. So he and I wrote those last two pieces together. So that's sort of what I'm going to focus on today, sort of building from that article. And if anybody wants it, It's behind paywalls. Things always are in academic publishing. If you want a copy of it, I'm happy to send it to you. I think I may have sent it to Pam before and shared it around. But if anybody wants it, just let me know and I can send it to you. And I got research reports down here too that I had to do for the research ethics board here that are summary things. But that's sort of what I published and where I'm at after 7 years or so of looking at this set of material. So the lingering questions from this, I mean, the SSHRC grant has come to an end. They keep sending me reports saying I have $83 left in my account for the grants. I don't know what to do with it, but eventually they'll claw it back and that'll be fine. So the lingering questions that have sort of come from this that I didn't focus on, but still kind of stand out to me. So the first one is just, policy cohesion. How does the amalgamation eventually maybe result in some policy cohesion? I don't know if it will. I mean, I know there were different timelines that people were talking about over which development, diplomacy, trade, consular would all sort of move in the same direction, particularly development and the political stream. But that's something I didn't quite look at, but it's an important question. How can you not just put these things under the same roof, but also get them on the same page and everyone working across streams in the same direction? And I know that's been a discussion internally at Global Affairs the last few years as well. The questions 2 and 3 are the ones that sort of relate to where I'm at the moment. The status of Canada's overseas network, what kind of support does it have? What kind of organization is there? What might be needed? How can it be better done? And because there's a lot of new things going on in diplomacy. There's digital diplomacy, there's a lot of public diplomacy. There's all kinds of new risks and hardships, which relates also to this question about COVID-19, the pandemic, how it sort of affected, what people do, but also how they work in place, right? With COVID being a global pandemic and affecting things and shaping policy outcomes, but also the way people work in an office together, perhaps, becomes a new form of hardship. So, these 2 last questions are kind of where I'm at and the direction I'm kind of going, but I haven't gotten very far with it yet. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Maybe we can discuss, you guys' perspectives on and give me some sense of how these things might be looked at usefully. All right. So hardship, and when I did my interviews with people, I did quite a few in Ottawa, speaking with people in the Pearson building or offsite somewhere just for convenience. I did a lot on Skype as well, which was quite good because then, I had a research grant, but the budget was modest by comparison to a lot of other grants that you might get if you're in the physical sciences or something. So I couldn't travel to too many places. I did 2 site visits at different Canadian embassies, one in Latin America and one in Africa, but and I'd been to one previously for different research in Southeast Asia, but so I did two visits at embassies, and I also was able to talk to a lot of people at Skype at couple dozen different locations around the world, right, where they were posted. And people always talk about their sort of experience at other posts and things like that in the discussions we had. So it was quite good. I got a sense of how people sort of move between posts, the relationship between being at post and being at headquarters, or as I guess people called it, at the mothership in Ottawa. And so that sort of took me down this track of, and particularly because I was looking at the integration of CETA and development into what's now Global Affairs Canada. A lot of the posts where development people might have a stronger presence, right, where there's more of them in the embassy, in the mission. They're in typically what might be more higher hardship posts, right? Just because of the nature of where those places are and the conditions in those capitals. So this has taken me into this realm of thinking about, hardship, rotationality. How do these things sort of shape how foreign services operates, right? The global affairs, but also other ones. And it's a lot of questions here that I'm thinking about that come from this, right? Like, how do they understand things like danger, risk, the difference in different places across the global network where they have sites? How do they manage the sort of global workforce of professionals who, move quite a bit, right? I've read a whole bunch of things about third culture kids. I've looked at people's institutions' handbooks on what it means to move your house. And I have one from a US context that's called how to move your house without losing your mind. There's a lot of research on that sort of support for the extended diplomatic network, which, the third point here, like accompanying family members at posts, what another group of geographers based in the Netherlands calls the microgeographies of particular posts, right? The actual, what's it like at that embassy? How is it integrated into the local scale, like in the fabric of the capital city? Which goes some way to determining what places are considered hardship, which places are seen as good posts to be at, even if there is some hardship. There's also the question I had before that sort of overarches everything, the kinds of knowledge and expertise that people are supposed to build and use as they move between these kinds of posts. It would be quite different being in, Kinshasa as opposed to Paris or Geneva. So, you're going to develop different kinds of local expertise and networks and knowledge, and then take it with you somewhere else. And then the larger geopolitical frameworks that shape sort of national interest and policy, right, within these institutions, and how people are acting as agents of the states and governments. And people manage these things in all kinds of ways. And I hope maybe we can have a discussion about this. The way institutions, foreign service institutions deal with this, right? There's lots of monetary incentives. There's ways of thinking about the built infrastructure of the embassy or consulate, of the kind of housing that people are provided with or help to find. There's the hardship rating systems, which I'll get to in a little bit. Lots of extra training, security training, and things of that nature. All the social supports that come with it, varying the length of rotational assignments. I know in some places 2 years. There may be more support for coming home from time to time in higher hardship locations. So, these are the kind of things that I've been starting to look at and gather information on. In the Canadian context, it's much easier. I'll come to the US and Canada are quite open about how they do these things. Some other foreign services, it's not as easy to find some of this information. It's not necessarily out there for public consumption the way it is in Ottawa and Washington. So, but I'll come back to that, because first, one of the things that really got me going on this was looking at Havana syndrome. And I don't know, maybe you can, I know there were some cases, the initial Havana syndrome incidents and cases in Havana, Cuba in 2016, 2017. And some of this just comes from the article that I had that came out earlier this year. The initial ones in Havana were Canadian and American. And I know there's the lawsuit by some of the people who have been posted there. There's been different studies. The American cases, there's been much more on this in the US. I've seen less of it in Canada. I know there was a series of articles in the Ottawa newspaper and some discussion, but now there's over 1,000 cases reported in the US among personnel who are State Department, but also a lot of people who work for the CIA, some business people as well who are on trade missions and things like that. It's an interesting case. I found I was drawn to it, one, because it echoes some Cold War frameworks, particularly in the US, that I wouldn't say I enjoy them, but I've studied them a lot. I understand it. There's quite a bit written on it. The sort of geopolitical thinking around responsibility for these kinds of things and how diplomacy and diplomats are part of that system. The media coverage in the US has been much more extensive, and it often doesn't mention the Canadian cases, or it only mentions them in passing, that there were some Canadians also affected. And then it immediately pivots to sort of what's become the official line is that there are probably sonic or microwave weapons. Like the source of people's symptoms is something secretive weaponry, something that's not quite out in the public eye, that we don't have enough intelligence on. And through this, you reassert sort of geopolitical frames. And there's a history to this. I don't know how many of you might be familiar with these things, but for a long time, there was people immediately go to something called the Moscow signal, where the Soviets from the 50s through the mid 70s beamed microwaves at the US Embassy in Moscow, which was, one tower block, and people worked and lived there. Two different ambassadors died of leukemia from that period. The US government found out about it, I think, in the 60s, mid 60s, and didn't do anything. They sort of used it as a point of study as well, because everybody was experimenting with microwaves as a form of weaponry. And when it finally came out, they put more shielding on the building. The Soviets agreed to stop doing it. They said they were trying to disrupt communications, not to give people cancer or cause physical harm. So when this came up with the Havana syndrome, that was one of the first points of sort of historical reference for a lot of people in the State Department, people in the Senate saying, well, this is a repeat of the Moscow signal incident. Right. So it's been framed very quickly as that, right, that there is some sort of nefarious intent by ideological geopolitical enemies. And that's the way it's gone. The Canadian government has had a very different response, to the point of saying, well, we don't really think there's any concrete medical diagnosis that can be called Havana syndrome. But both governments the US had just reopened its embassy in Havana when this started happening under Obama, and then Trump very quickly closed it again, and pulled a bunch of people out. And both governments have now given Havana the highest hardship rating, which for the Canadian context, I think was quite a shift. Havana had been seen as a relatively good posting by a lot of people. There's good relations between Canada and Cuba. There's a diplomatic neighborhood, I think it's called Mirabel, where a lot of diplomatic housing is located, and there's international school. And the US embassy was like off somewhere else from the other embassies, and it had been shuttered for a long time. So yeah, it was an interesting, like a sort of similar result in terms of the hardship rating of the post, but very different responses by the two governments, right, to this particular incident. And then in the US, it's just taken off. So there's been more than 1,000 cases. They've been reported in places in Russia, particularly in Moscow, in China, in some of the consulate offices in China, some in Serbia, some Vienna has become, I think, one of the places where there's been the largest number of cases sort of reported. And this is self-reported. And the article that I had read about that, it's hard to get the full numbers. I'm working on trying to figure out, like, map out where have there been cases and why in those places. The framing in the media coverage of the ones in Vienna, and there's not many, is just that Vienna has always been a hotbed of spies, which again is a sort of Cold War framing, right? Vienna as a kind of crossroads in East-West relations in Europe during the Cold War. And so this has gotten to the point where last year, about a year ago now, Congress passed the Havana Act, which they're very good at coming up with these acronyms. I didn't realize the Patriot Act was also an acronym, but I can't remember what Patriot stands for. But the Havana Act, Helping American Victims Afflicted by Neurological Attacks Act. And they're providing monetary compensation to people who have been reporting symptoms. There is a very hot debate among medical professionals about the cause, the kinds of symptoms. There's some patterns, but it's not coherent across all people reporting them. They get very different kinds of symptoms. People have proposed everything from the mating call of the West Indian cricket, which apparently is as loud as an airplane if it's in the room with you, to exposure to insecticides, which I think there was a medical study at Dalhousie of some of the people in the Canadian Foreign Service who had been affected and family members, and they were reporting out similar kinds of there is some brain injury that looks like what you would get from being exposed to certain kinds of insecticide, which were being sprayed at the time in Cuba quite heavily to control Zika virus. But it wasn't a sort of smoking gun absolute diagnosis, right? It was just saying there are some similarities here that might need to be followed up on. So, this sort of took me into this realm of thinking, okay, well, what kinds of hardship are we talking about? What are the new risks that emerge? You've got two governments that have very different relations with Cuba, but they come to the same result in terms of using hardship rating as a way of shaping how they're going to use that post in their global network and how it's viewed. And I hope to do more with this, but it's an ongoing, developing sort of thing. And I have a research assistant now who's going to help me track down cases. We got to talk to AFSA, the American Foreign Service Association. They've had quite a bit of coverage of this in the Foreign Service Journal. Maybe they can help with some of it. So, but then you're talking about people's like medical records and stuff. Some of it's sensitive, particularly because the folks from the CIA work alongside the people from the State Department and some of the embassies, and so they're a bit cagey about who's been affected by what, because they don't want to reveal where they have certain numbers of CIA officials and assets and things like that. So that's the example that sort of has drawn me into this. And, I was interested in embassies as well, but it took me into thinking about hardship ratings. And as I said, it's not always easy to find these. The research assistant and I, Jana is her name, I have her now on the case looking for similar things to what you guys have in the Foreign Service directives and what the US posts on State Department website, which is, constantly updated. It's publicly accessible. It's easy to find. The UN Civil Service Commission also has very clear sort of publicly accessible layout of how they, not only how things get, which posts fall into which hardship categories, but also the process by which they review and determine those ratings, right, which are done on a regular basis. So other countries, the UK is very cagey about this. I found a list in a parliamentary Hansard, because it was just asked about in a committee, and they have a third party that they contract out to sort of help them assess things. I think we have one from Australia, but I haven't had a chance to look at it. Germany has like a 20-point hardship scale or something. So much more involved than the sort of 5-level thing that you see in some other places. So I'm looking for these kinds of things, which I might ask if anybody knows where you might get these, because I think in some places they're just internal, right? They're used for personnel decisions and they don't sort of have them out in the public eye. But I'm sure they exist, right? Because I think this is a pretty common way of managing different kinds of posts in an overseas network for a foreign service. Right. So in Canada, I mean, you guys have in global affairs, the FSDs, the salary premiums for dependents, for different posts, for the levels of hardship, which are sort of categorized in 5 things or 5 levels. There's the coordinating committee that recommends this. The US has a regular questionnaire they send out, and an interagency committee that sort of reviews it and determines the hardship based, which is then categorized, 5, 10, 15, 20, up to 35% premiums. And then they have danger pay on top of that and some other things. The UN Civil Service has clear 6 different criteria that that they use, and they have 5 levels of hardship, and then some that are not hardship at all, that have, particularly European posts or in the most developed countries. So pretty clear, like not that different among these 3 examples, but I'm trying to find others, and just to see what's the sort of norm, what are the best practices, are there ways in which how do they actually come to the hardship rating, right? What are the processes internally that help determine that, and then how does it get reviewed and things like that? Just sort of the machinery of developing these ratings, because I think they're quite important for people's thinking of what are good posts, where are they going to go, the different ideas about what hardship actually is. I know in the Canadian context, there's sort of a comparison. This doesn't go into hardship, but to sort of allowances, a sort of consumer price index relationship between Ottawa and the different other places where you might get posted. So there's all kinds of things that might factor into that. So I'm interested in this kind of, transnational comparison as a kind of first cut at just looking at, what's the mechanisms by which hardship is actually defined and determined in these different national contexts. And it is hard to find them. Hopefully we'll get some. I have my research assistant sort of emailing and calling different embassies and consulates and things. So, but they don't always get back to her. So from that, the lingering question I had before, and I think I talked about this last year, was I was doing some historical work, and the pandemic just threw everything off on foreign service spouses, and the sort of what I'd started calling a sort of extended diplomatic network, right? The people that work and live at posts that aren't necessarily just the sort of formal personnel, right? Like who are foreign service officers, but people often bring their families for a long time. There was a very clear sort of inclusion of your wife as part of your performance review, because almost all foreign service officers were men. Because there's a kind of performance that has to happen, and they were doing a lot of informal work. And there's been things around this. I've got that point there about sort of parallel and subsidiary institutions that work on greater supports, particularly around supports for dependents and families. So there's the unions and professional associations like PASO and AFSA. In Britain and the Scandinavian countries, I know the wives often had sort of banded together and formed advocacy associations. In the US, it's developed into the American Association for Foreign Service Wives. As there's been more gender equity, they've changed the name but kept the acronym. I think now it's I can't remember what the acronym stands for. It's something, Association for Advocating for Foreign Service Worldwide or something. They kept the acronym because it had sort of been rooted in place since the early 70s. But the institutional histories are not fully developed. So I was working on that, and then the pandemic just kind of threw me off. And I'm thinking now of how to include it back in this larger issue of hardship, right? Because thinking about hardship is exacerbating concerns that already exist, right? It's another layer on top of things around equity, pay, people's career trajectories, increasing concerns with people's mental health, particularly because of COVID, but predating that as well, because of the nature of the work. Support for spouses finding employment, for schools, for isolation within the network, right? If you're far from home. Have you guys ever looked, this is a bad question, but I have like 3 or 4 versions of like foreign service handbook that have been produced internally, and I think it's different now. Like they're mostly tied to the foreign service directives, but I have a couple from the 90s, and there's one at the end that has a suggested reading for foreign service officers, and there's lots of tips about what to do with your furs and how to deal with salt and pepper shakers and tropical climates and things that are like practical knowledge that's clearly just been cobbled together and handed down. But the one from, I think it's 1994, it's got suggested reading in 3 themes at the very end of the Foreign Service Handbook. And one is how to deal with your elderly parents when you're far away. One is something about moving house and dealing with the logistics. And then there's another one about divorce. So those are the 3 themes for suggested reading. So clearly there were some concerns before COVID and the hardships exacerbate all of these things, right? So how that sort of enters into concerns for the larger support system for people doing their work and bringing their family and being comfortable and being productive at work in these far-flung sort of networks, right? And it's still a sore spot. I mean, I know it's a discussion that comes up quite a bit, and it came up a lot in my interviews, and it wasn't a focal point, so I didn't pursue it very much. But now I'm sort of starting to turn toward that, and how can I sort of work it in, thinking about hardship as supports and extended family as a kind of component of that. There's a lot of things I could do, but whether I am able to ever get around to them, I'm throwing them out there and seeing what sticks as I keep working on it. So that's where I'll stop. I mean, what I'd like to have a discussion about here, I'll just turn my slides off because I don't, then you can see my face. Those of you that have been in hardship posts, thinking about how you manage that, whether people, I know some people love the idea of hardship and they pursue those. I know it does lean, as I said, toward the development side. If people compare notes across context, if people in other diplomatic services, how that comes up in discussions. I mean, this is sort of where I'm at with these things. So, I mean, I'm hoping, I didn't create like a big long presentation. I could talk about embassy design as well, because there's some of that in the paper. Although a lot of that is about the US context. The US had for a long time an embassy template, basically. I guess they still do the standard embassy design, as a response to bombings in Tanzania and Kenya in the late 90s. But they're pretty far ahead on that as a sort of securing the actual sites of diplomatic work and life. But yeah, anything that you guys want to have a discussion about from these themes would be great, because I haven't had a chance to talk to many people internally just since I sort of wrapped up most of my initial interview work. And yeah, like I said, the pandemic and small children have sort of kept me from pursuing some of this in more depth, but now I'm back on it, so yeah, if people want to share stories or ask me questions, or I can sort of have a conversation with you guys about some of this, would be great.
Oh, okay, thanks. No, sorry, somebody's just pointing out in the Q&A, because they have no option, that apparently it looks like we somehow disabled attendee chat.
Oh, no.
So, I don't know how we did that. Honestly, every time I use Zoom, they've changed something about the settings so that my old settings don't apply. But I'll ask Marty if he can fix that while we're doing stuff. In the meantime, special permission this one time only to use the chat for your comments, or to do like Tam did and put her hand up.
Yeah.
So maybe Marty, can you promote Tam so that she can talk?
I can speak. I think you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I just thought I'll raise something as a single now, FS. I could have used that divorce handbook back in 2000. But anyway, I have something we don't really, Canada's very egalitarian. Everyone's the same. All diplomats are the same. And it doesn't matter if you're at post with your wife and 3 kids or you're there all alone, you're the same and you're equal. But whereas I was talking to my friend from the Dutch embassy across the parking lot, and they said for single foreign service officers, they get 2 trips home a year versus 1 for people with families. For example, you could say, oh, I'm stuck at post for Christmas. If you're with your wife and 3 kids, you're not alone. Whereas if you're a single, you may be sitting in your apartment all by yourself on Christmas Day. So there's sort of this understanding that being completely unsupported in a posting, of course, this doesn't count for like FS or level 5 unaccompanied, etc., but that your life is different and you don't have the same support that a family does. Yeah. Or even just a couple. And I don't see that reflected in Canada because we're all the same, and that wouldn't be fair that one person got a trip back and the other didn't. Yeah. We're not very good at that nuanced, and I don't know if the US system is similar, if they're again like sort of like us, like everybody gets the same thing.
Yeah, I think it's probably more like the Canadian system. I would have to look at, I have quite a few things from the AAFSW and, the State Department, but I haven't looked as deeply into that aspect of it yet. But yeah, it would be, I wonder if it's also a cost thing, if they're like, oh, we got to fly a family back as opposed to an individual. Because it can get expensive, I'm sure, but yeah.
But everybody gets the 1 trip. And then if you have, a few singles, that's obviously less of a financial outlay. But it's just, as a single, sometimes you think like, wow, it would be nice to be able to fly my family for $12,000 down, my parents or whatever, but no, that's not gonna happen.
Yeah, and it's been one of those things that advocates for people with family, they're sort of trying to pick up some of the supports and not just say, oh, the Foreign Service should be getting free labor from my wife and kids when we have parties that we have to host, or she has to, present at the women's club or something like that. And the US has moved quite a bit toward that. There was a major shift in the early 70s, 1972. I think they had a major policy shift towards saying, we won't consider the spouses of foreign service members to be informal employees, basically, right? But then with that, you have to start saying, okay, well, if they're not, then how do we support them? Because it's a condition of work that you have to go abroad. So yeah, the US is, I think, much more like the Canadian system in that respect. In terms, it depends though. There's quite a bit I was reading about the US had expeditionary diplomacy. That was the term Condoleezza Rice had sort of coined in the early 2000s. and the embassy design, the way they manage some of the hardship posts reflects that. Like there's some places where, I guess it's the same in GAC, you just can't take your family, like it's not allowed.
Yeah.
They also got to, they had a problem with staffing hardship posts for a while, right? There's reports on this from the Government Accountability Office and State Department reports about, how can we get people wanted to go to London, Mexico City, Geneva, Paris, they didn't want to necessarily go to the more difficult posts where there might be conflict and more crime or environmental risks. And they couldn't staff them very easily. And so they were trying to figure out how can we encourage people to do this, fill these posts. And I would imagine, like saying supports for families with travel and stuff becomes an inducement as part of that, right? Like you can bring your family. If it's a hardship 4 or 5, they're probably not going to let them go. But yeah, it was difficult in the U.S. case. They just, you want to be seen. But then when they did expeditionary diplomacy and they rebuilt the middle of Baghdad as the U.S. embassy compound, then they started to attract, people were describing them as basically like a sort of cowboy mentality, right? You go into Baghdad for 6 months and make like 3 years worth of money and then leave. And it got to the point where it had reversed. Like if you weren't going to some of the most hardship locations, you weren't going to move up, right? It became a sort of career path to like go and be in these difficult places where you're not allowed to take your family. You're there as an individual, and you're in a big, very heavily securitized compound. And yeah, the Canadian system, it just doesn't exist in that same way. There's not the same kind of posts, right, where you're in a fortress. So yeah, but I imagine the US is similar, right? It's an inducement to get people to go to those hardship posts.
Yeah. Well, there was just an interesting article Tam, I think, just posted on our Facebook group by, I don't know, Nick Coughlin, who was a retired Foreign Service officer, about our mission in Juba and how they were working out of his garage. And
and they had like sort of portable mobile units and things like that. Is that right?
Yeah. But it's, talking about some of the social hazards of being on those missions where, people can't take their families. Someone comments, yeah, the problem with Juba is there's too many MBAs, married but available, right? When I started, there were more people when we were all younger. More people wanted to go on hardship posts just because A, you got more money, and B, it was sort of more interesting. If you're in a big mission in London, as a junior officer, you're still pretty far down the hierarchy. But if you go to a small place, you have a lot more autonomy and decision-making authority and so on. And and I got to say, then as you get older, my last assignment was in Warsaw, and I was quite happy to be there. I see Lori has had her hand up for a while, so maybe we could let Lori talk, and then
and I see one that's in the Q&A that we can come back to after Lori.
There is Lori talking. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I find it curious too that our department, and I don't know if you've seen this with other governments, in an effort to ensure that the Canadian public sees that we're paying our way and that we're not getting anything free and all of that, we actually get our allowances and then they deduct our shelter share off of it. So we have to pay an amount for the pleasure of living in whatever SQ they put us in. And it's based on some Statistics Canada amount. And to be perfectly honest, it's not that much money for the amount that I pay every month. There's no way I'd ever be able to get even a 2-bedroom apartment probably in Ottawa. But it's across the whole world. We all pay the same thing. So, and I just find it really strange that they go to such lengths to prove to the Canadian public, to the taxpayer, that we're not so special, that, they give us money in one hand and then take it back. In fact, it's deducted from the allowances every month. That's just one example. There's many others. And then, of course, the inequity in housing as well. We just had a discussion. We had an MCO conference last week in Berlin, and this discussion came up about how your shelter share is the same whether you're in private lease, hybrid, Crown leased, Crown owned, and yet they vary quite widely across
Yeah.
the spectrum. So kind of a lot of inequities there, you know, not, obviously it's not preventing people from going abroad, but it's
Yeah.
just another one of these sort of manufactured kind of systems, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. The housing like stock and what is available and whether you have to sort of like look for something or if something is available. I've heard that from quite a few people in different posts. And the couple that I went to as well, it came up in sort of oblique ways, but not in the interview so much. It's just like random conversations with people. Yeah, that's and inflation, I guess the way inflation has been kind of skyrocketing the past year would definitely affect some of this as well, because that's going to be it's a global phenomenon, but I imagine it's going to be quite uneven depending on the post. And somebody in an interview, one of the last ones that I did, described working for global affairs as sort of being in a golden cage, right? It's like the pace of the work, and you know, you paid to like travel and go to these places, and it's great, and it's very exciting, and then you end up spending a lot of money to do the work, right? Particularly they were talking about housing and having your family in certain places where you can go, and it, you know, the expenses are not covered in the way that you would want to do the kind of work you're asked to do. So I know that's been a sore spot, and yeah, and they have the like a CPI indexing sort of thing with Ottawa, and I don't know how that compares. I know in Ottawa the prices are crazy right now, right? Like for housing and everything else. I mean, Windsor's a little bit less so, just because we're Windsor. Yeah, I know in other cities like it's been quite expensive, in Ottawa chief among them. So yeah, I don't know how they're doing that, because they do compare it to sort of the Ottawa area for allowances. And yeah, this sort of public, being in the public eye and like wanting to show that you're using the money wisely. And I mean, some of that just comes from the history of thinking like, oh, diplomats are just people at cocktail parties with their pinstripe suits and, you know, and rubbing shoulders and not really doing real work, which of course is untrue, but it's the image that a lot of people have of, you know, wasteful spending. And you know, it doesn't help when you have to go live somewhere for 3 or 4 years and pay a huge amount of money for an apartment. Yeah, so there was a question over here. There's a question in the chat and a question in the Q&A. Laura, I don't know if that sort of spoke to your point, but yeah. I find the microgeography of this, that term that I used, interesting, because the one article I'm getting that from is about how embassies are sort of located in cities, and they create these sort of like clusters. And there's always neighborhoods where there's a sort of diplomatic housing is sort of clustered together, and people from multiple foreign services might all be there, you know, near an embassy row or something, because they do tend to create sort of these zones in capital cities. And I don't know how that affects pricing and things like that at the local scale, but you know, there is a sense that you want to live in the area that's like the diplomatic zone, right? Because there might be schools there, there might be the networking opportunities with your colleagues in your own department and other places, right? So that, you know, that does also sort of shape the pricing component of what is available for people living in those places, I would think. There's the question in the Q&A is, how does Canada compare to other countries when posting is classified as non-hardship, not being hardship at all? And what does Canada consider as qualifying for non-hardship? And then maybe how that's changed with COVID. It's an interesting question. Pam, you might know better than me what's actually going on, but it is something that, you know, I'm interested in how COVID has changed that, because I know different countries had very different responses to this, and hardship suddenly takes on a different meaning if you're in a place where there's like hardcore lockdowns.
Yeah, I mean, I think COVID really, I don't know, I mean, that really threw a lot of things into, you know, there a lot of stuff came up under COVID that had never really been thought of before. And I think, I mean, you know, there is an argument to be made, and I've heard some people make it, that, maybe because it was all new, maybe some of those posts, in hindsight, maybe, more people were evacuated than needed to be evacuated. I mean, that's a question. And, I'm not really particularly interested in second guessing the employer on that, because, they were dealing with something that none of us had ever seen before. And they acted from the perspective of duty of care and had to make judgment calls. And, I can only imagine what it would have been like to be in that situation. The other thing is it's always relative to Canada, right?
Yeah.
So like if there are mask mandates and, lockdowns to a certain extent and school closures and things like that in Canada, and there are school closures, at your mission, well, it's a different situation, right? If it's happening in Canada and it's also happening overseas. And, I know we had, people saying, well, I'm having to, homeschool my kids now at post. And, where's the FSD for that? What help can I get? And, the employer came back and said, well, people are having to homeschool their kids in Canada too. And no extra money is being provided for that. So you're not disadvantaged in terms of what was going on in Canada. Now, some people would say, well, hey, wait a minute, like in Canada, you still have all of the other infrastructure.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it's pretty complicated. So honestly, I don't know. I mean, I do think we want more. We're going into the next round of negotiations on the FSDs fairly soon. And one of the things we would like is a lot more transparency on how these assessments are made. Right now, there's an NJC negotiating or NJC committee made up of bargaining agents and the employer that deals with the FSD, does the negotiations and is the final interpretation on the intent of the FSDs. But we don't have bargaining agent representation on, what people here will recognize, the famous working groups A and B, which are the sort of departmental level groups that, often are called on to make expert type decisions. And I think we should have that. I think we need more insight into the granularity of things. So I don't really have an answer. It's a good question. And I'd like an answer to it too.
Yeah, the threshold for non-hardship is interesting too. I mean, if you look at the play, I think of the US system where they do it in these 5% pay intervals. That's sort of how you can see the hardship. And, like Baghdad, Kabul, Juba, these are like 35%, like highest level. And then they often have an additional pay. And then there's the ones that are like 5%. It's like, well, what constitutes like a 5% pay differential? Like what level of hardship is that? Like, it's hard to know. I mean, I've looked a little bit at the questionnaire, but it's not always open, but it's got multiple data points on it. And then they have a big discussion around it. And it's not clear necessarily what the criteria are where you would get to 5%. If it, is it just a matter of there being sort of health infrastructure, or there's not good schools, or it's hard to get there because you have to take 3 flights or something. But it's unclear. Like most of the ones in Western Europe, Japan, developed countries, they don't merit hardship pay. It's the same for the UN system. And then it's hard to know. And then when something like COVID happens, like, well, then you have to you're back on your heels figuring out, like, is this temporary? Is it permanent? Like, what's the situation in flux? The threshold for what constitutes like the first sort of cut at, like, this is the first level of hardship. It's unclear. It seems to be moving. I mean, the mechanism is there. You can look at, like, well, how do they do it? Well, they have this process. Well, what goes into that? Well, then it's harder to figure out. So that's one of the things I have to look at. I'm trying to get those things from other countries and sort of do a comparison across countries just to see the processes and how open and transparent the data is that's used for that. So yeah.
Somebody's asking in the chat if the comparison is to Canada or to Ottawa, and they're right. Generally, it's to the headquarters city, which for most of us is the national capital region. So you're right. There can be a lot of variation among different things. I just have to get up. There's somebody at my door, so I will leave you to answer the next question if that's okay.
Yeah. I see Perry has a couple of questions here. Hi, Perry. So the one about harassment, given isolation, that one I don't know. That would be an interesting question to look at as part of this, because I know in the past, I mean, going back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, there was a sense that, as a rotational workforce, the way you deal with problems between personnel is you move one of them around. So that was one way of dealing with harassment. I mean, they wouldn't have necessarily used that term at the time: harassment, bullying, interpersonal disputes. You just move people, right? If they can't get along, and sometimes that's if you've only got like a handful of people at a post for some of the more isolated, smaller ones. The idea that you got to work together becomes very strong. So yeah, that I don't know though. I would have to look at that. I know there's been increased attention to that sort of mental health in the workplace, about equity issues, as there's sort of attempts to get more gender equity in particular. It can be difficult, and particularly in some of the more hardship posts. I mean, again, the U.S. examples in places like Kabul and Baghdad, where it becomes a very there is a mentality of like we're here as like the part of like a military detachment almost, and not just as sort of diplomats. It can feed into some of this, particularly when there's isolation at compounds, right? It can feed into that. The other question you had, I guess it wasn't a question. The American embassies, yeah, they're quite. They did have the standard embassy design for a while, and now they have some other. I forget the name that they have now. So the American embassies are often, the newer ones are ugly as sin. Like, they're so ugly, and they're sometimes outside of where the normal embassy row or where the sort of diplomatic cluster are, because they require these giant setbacks and a lot of security infrastructure. And so they can't necessarily be built in the same sort of like city cores where a lot of other embassies might be when they build the new ones. And because of that, they're treated as like fortified compounds. And so, yeah, they'll have a lot of amenities, and it might be the only Starbucks in the place and everybody wants to go there. But yeah, then it's part of a logistics network, right? Whereas the Canadian embassies I've been to are not like that. They're like in office buildings, or they're special buildings, but they're integrated into the part of the city where everything else is for diplomatic material. So it's, yeah, I can see being envious of them though. I mean, they're pretty. I was in the one in Jakarta because I was doing work on like development institutions in Jakarta and urban aid programs. And yeah, the US embassy, they had a really nice cafeteria, and they're like a giant compound with like huge security infrastructure and a little garden inside. The Canadian embassy was like the 9th floor of an office building, very nondescript, and a lot of them were like that, like glass and steel offices, but the American one always just felt like, oh, I'm at, I've ventured into some compound where it looks totally different behind the wall. So
yeah, I mean, some of that is just a function of size, right? I mean,
Yeah.
generally the American embassies are staffed at 10 to 1.
yeah, they're big. Yeah,
Staff to us. And they often have a military presence that then brings
Yeah.
that logistics network and so on.
yeah.
Yeah, I see Kale has his hand up there very patiently.
Okay.
Hey, Jamie, nice to see you again. Thanks for the presentation.
Yeah.
Just one note that may be interesting for your future research, and that's in the way that our assignments process takes place. Normally, you'll have the list of assignments abroad come out in the fall, and people who are in the Foreign Service group are prioritized for those over non-rotational traditional employees. And so for positions that aren't filled in the first round, then there's normally a second round that takes place in the new year, and then a third round, and occasionally a fourth round, and so on. And as those lists go on, the criteria for applying to those positions for non-rotational FS becomes incremental, or non-rotational GAC employees becomes incrementally easier, and the proportion of hardship assignments on those lists as a percentage grows higher and higher.
Yeah.
So it has kind of been that as things go on, if there's nothing else left, then this is the opportunity for non-rotational trade commissioners or others to move into those positions. And part of that is a function of a freeze on FS hiring over the course of the decade, where we haven't necessarily had all of those. And it will be interesting to see what happens to the the postings of last resort, so to speak, now that we are re-recruiting at the FS1 level and bringing in additional intake to see from there. No question attached to this, but just sort of it will be interesting to see as a trend whether or not has our hardship assignments a backdoor in to then have the sort of skills and experience that would come in handy for a future competition to get in at the FS level. And I can think of another number of folks who have come in that route and done very good jobs precisely because they were willing to do the quote dirty work end quote that you don't necessarily see.
Yeah, and be in a place where it may not be either as attractive for people who are sort of mid-career or have done multiple postings. And yeah, it's an interesting question, like how people sort of migrate to those posts, right? And I think in the context of the sort of, I guess, lingering amalgamation work that has to be done, of seeing, which, because I know the FSIA search that happened, right? Like that in some way was meant to direct people into some of those, what might otherwise be hardship postings, right? Because they're in developing countries and they tend to lean more toward higher levels of hardship. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know how easy it is to get some of that information. I mean, I know it's, like how different rounds of postings have gone, right? Like, do they make those things publicly available, Pam? Do you know? Like, if I wanted to say, like, which posts went through like 2, 3, 4 rounds before they were filled, like, would they share that info?
They might. I mean, I don't know that they would have it in a kind of like a integrated package, but they could, like, you could ask for the different lists of the different rounds, and then that would show you, right? Like the ones that are on round 3 or 4. Those are the ones that were harder to fill.
I always wonder, because they might be reluctant to share some things that might be easily tracked to particular personnel, because some of the posts may be smaller. And anecdotally, I lived next door when I was a PhD student. I was living in New York for a year doing research there, and I lived next door to some guy who had studied languages at Cornell, and he spoke like 8 languages or something. And he had done an internship with the State Department, and he ended up in Vientiane in Laos, because he said, they sent me there as an intern. Nobody wanted to go.
Yeah,
it was a hub, hub and spoke system with the Bangkok embassy. So he was like, we were, a spoke off of the Bangkok embassy, but there was an ambassadorial residence there whenever they wanted to send the ambassador if they had to go to Laos for whatever reason. So it was like, they just sent me there, and I just spent the summer there, like swimming in the pool and doing, whatever paperwork they wanted me to do. But it was like, I couldn't believe nobody wanted to go there, right? Like it was a great place. The people were nice. The food was interesting. You like learn all this stuff in this like far flung place. But people are like, no, I want to be in Bangkok where I can be seen,
Well, and things really, like, I've noticed that things really change depending on like all kinds of different factors, right? With posts, like you were talking about Havana. I mean, Havana used to be a heavy demand. Like there, they would always get lots of applications. Years ago, I was deputy director for the Middle East, and I had the Levant, so Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. And I remember we had a junior political position in Cairo, and one year I got no applicants.
Really?
The next time, because it was at that time, junior first postings were 2 years, and then maybe you could extend, but probably not. So 2 years later, I got 35 applications for that one. And not that much had changed. Like, in fact, the living conditions had probably deteriorated a little bit, but for whatever reason, I mean, slightly different senior management, maybe, different, just different things.
Different cohort of people in that particular year, maybe.
Yeah.
I guess it's also dynamic, right? If there's other posts that aren't open yet, like the people are looking for other things, and
Well, and like I suspect with COVID, that there probably are some people who were always like, you know, hardship 4 and above, or, you know, or go home or stay home kind of thing, who now looked at, you know, maybe how difficult it was for people in some of these places, how hard it was to evacuate, how hard it was to get back, all of that, and kind of say, ooh, you know, maybe not, right?
Yeah. And the social life at the post, you know, if you're dependent quite a bit on the people you work with, right? If it's a smaller post or something, or a far-flung place where there's, you know, a bit of a disconnect from the local context, suddenly you like can't meet with those people in the same way, you know, like the isolation becomes that much harder, right?
Well, but you know, it's interesting because pre-COVID, and we haven't seen stats or to have an objective sense of whether there's a difference, but before COVID, GAC used to have more requests for early termination. And I think this is pretty much true of the US and Australia as well, because I remember having a conversation with friends about this. The places where we had people asking to come home early most often were the Nordic countries.
Oh.
Oslo, Stockholm, Helsinki, those places.
Yeah, because it's dark also, 3 months out of the year.
Yeah. And but also some consulates in the US.
Oh.
And, you know, some of that is like, you go to those places, you know, even when I was in Kandahar, like I was never alone in Kandahar unless I really tried to be. I had company all the time. I always had someone to talk to. Someone was always willing to listen to me, you know, about whatever was going on. They didn't necessarily know what I was doing, but, you know, and then you go to some other places and you're much more isolated. No one helps you find your groceries, you know, all of those kinds of things. So I mean, you know, the question early on about like what really makes a hardship post, I think sometimes maybe we need to have a bit more nuanced look at that.
Yeah.
And, you know, years ago when I first started, people used to joke that a place like Riyadh, for example, should be, you know, maybe a hardship 2 for men, but a hardship 5 for women.
Oh, yeah.
To just laugh at that. And now, I mean, with our GBA plus lens, I mean, I'm thinking, why did we question that? Of course. I mean, there are things that women are subject to in some places, or some people are subject to that other people are not. Same with racism or homophobia, or, you know.
I can imagine there's some places where you wouldn't want to send an openly gay colleague, you know.
To some places, I mean, it's
and then there's the comment here about how you make, Perry talking about making, this is actually one of the ways I got into thinking about this sort of extended sort of family network. Somebody had sent me, I mean, I was asking around about it, but somebody had sent me they created a newsletter in Bonn in like the early 80s, because there were so many people sort of cycling through like new families that they just started making this newsletter among themselves and sharing information. And, you know, it was things like so-and-so's got a birthday party, or, you know, here's where you can go and find places for your kids. And, you know, it seemed to be like an influx of like new families coming into that post, and it sort of spurred them to do that. But also reading the Ugly American, the novel from the late 50s, where there's this sort of apocryphal story at the end where the two authors, because they were talking about the US presence in Thailand, but it was sort of a made up country that they used as their example in the novel, the fictionalization of it. But at the end they were saying, oh, you know, we were doing research for this book. You know, we talked to one of our Thai interpreters. You know, we invited him to something, or he invited us to something, and we said, no, we have an event and in the embassy. And he's like, oh, the SIG, the SIGG. And they were like, what does that mean? Oh, that's what we call you guys. It's social incest in the Golden Ghetto, because you like, you know, it's like such a tight little diplomatic community, and you don't ever engage with the local context or with us. You know, we're just sort of like your backdrop. And they were like, huh, interesting. And that sort of spurred the way they were thinking about, you know, sort of clueless American officials in Southeast Asia. So I still think there's maybe some of that in certain places, but you know, COVID definitely didn't help that. But
no, and you know, and some people like that. They like the expat bubble, and some people really hate it, you know, and really don't want to do that. So there's kind of a constituency for every type of assignment, or there used to be. I mean, what worries me a bit with the way GAC went for a while was there was so little recruiting, you know, that we weren't kind of replenishing our pools of, you know, adventurous young folk who are willing to go anywhere. Like,
Yeah.
my
Yeah, that
first-
happens when you don't hire in, right? Like you don't get the same people who are like eager to build a certain kind of knowledge base and experience, right?
Yeah. Somebody is asking, do any other countries consider whether there is a reciprocal work arrangement in place in assessing hardship levels? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, what would that mean? Reciprocal work arrangements? Just so I know
So
exactly.
generally, so spouses could work.
Oh, I see. Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's some. I mean, that was one of the points of organizing among foreign service spouses in the 70s, right? And there's some Cynthia Enloe, a famous book about what's it called? Bananas, Beaches, and Bases, sort of a feminist IR, like sort of groundbreaking work in the late 80s. And she put out a new edition in the early 2000s. There's quite a bit in there on that about women, particularly, I think it was the Denmark, Sweden, the UK, and the US, like not long after, organizing around exactly these questions, right? Like, what kind of work arrangements are there for women who are accompanying spouses? And, because a lot of women just gave up their careers at the time. I mean, the US Foreign Service has a really good online set of like, there must be 2,000 of them, interviews, like exit interviews with people from, the last 30, 40 years. It's like the Association for Diplomatic Service Training or something. It's sort of a arm's length function of the State Department and the Foreign Service, and AFSA, where they've just done a bunch of exit interviews with people who were Foreign Service officers, US aid officers, and also quite a few spouses. So I had gathered some of this with a previous research assistant, and this is where COVID sort of disrupted it. But reading the stories of women who had like accompanied spouses in the 50s and 60s and 70s, even like Julia Child, whose husband was a Foreign Service officer, they had to give up their careers. Many of them were like professional women, upper middle class, and suddenly they're just like the trailing spouse. So pushing back against that, I think, is one of the things that's happened, right? And like sort of arranging work opportunities, allowing people to sort of continue their careers or find outlets for them. It's I mean, the US has a pretty extensive system for this now, but it had to be sort of fought for from the early 70s on, and now it's sort of integrated into the system there, probably more so even than what Canada's got, I would think. But yeah, and there's some things like that in in the Nordic countries. A lot of the European countries, I think, have that, particularly because they have the EU system as well, where if you're not cycling through like Brussels at some point, you're probably not moving up in your career in any of the EU countries. So, and there it's easier, right, to sort of arrange these things just because of the proximity of stuff.
Yeah, no, for sure. Hey, I'm just looking at the clock. It's quarter after almost, and we're running over on the time that we asked you for. But I appreciate the discussion a lot. I mean, I know some people have had to leave, but others are welcome to stay. I can stay for about another 10 minutes. I have another meeting at 3:30. So do you want to see if we have a...
Yeah, sure. How many? I didn't even look how many people are in here now. Oh, we still have 7. Yeah, I'm. Yeah, I mean, I have to call through some of my old interviews to see where I've got some information on this, and think about which questions I'm most interested in sort of pursuing. Because I don't have any funding right now, but Skype makes the stuff easy. Like I wouldn't be able to travel to too many places right now anyway. I'm gonna have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old at home, so I'm not gonna drag them to a bunch of hardship posts. But
yeah, I mean,
dropping in for 3 days doesn't really give you a sense of what's going on at a post. But doing interviews with people, I mean, I'd have to go through another sort of round of research ethics and think about what I want to ask. But I am interested in this. I mean, the Havana syndrome thing is taking off in the US. I mean, it's become a major, particularly with the war in Ukraine. There's a lot of interest in blaming things on Russia. And maybe it is true. I don't know. I mean, they haven't been able to give definitive proof, but I mean, it's definitely in the news quite a bit. It's more and more cases, and so that's one particular case study. But yeah, the
Yeah.
the ability to do more interviews remotely is very good. So I mean, hopefully I can pick up on that in the next year or so and start on this again.
Well, and and if we can help you with anything, I mean, let me know, and we can ask for volunteers, or
Yeah.
want to engage with specific areas, see if we can find people who who would be
Well, if anyone
interested.
has contacts at other embassies where you could like get their hardship ratings, because it's been difficult to find. Not everybody has a super extensive set of documents available on their website, and so I was poking around looking at the Japanese foreign ministry and the French foreign ministry, and I think we have one from Australia, we have one from Germany, like Turkey, South Africa. Like I haven't been able to find much, but we just started looking in the last couple of weeks. But to me, it's like, well, if I can't easily get to it through a few clicks on the web, then it's probably hidden somewhere, or I need to ask somebody. But I am, the Canadian and the American and the UN, they're pretty open about how they do this, and it's easy to find that information. Because that rating thing, I mean, it is an interesting sort of case study in how countries think about where it would be hard to be for an American or a Canadian. I imagine the South African Foreign Service maybe has a different sense of what hardship means, right? Because of their relationship with their neighbors, they may not see it as such a hardship because of geographic proximity, or just sort of people having social networks there that are more easily called on than if you're sent from Ottawa or something. So, but I won't know until I get it. It's hard to find those things. So if anyone has any of those and wants to pass them on to me, don't do anything you shouldn't do. But
Do you want to? You could type your email in the chat if you wanted,
Sure.
for people to contact you directly if they want to.
Yeah, if you have
drop
any information that you
document.
have put together, that's my email address. Feel free to contact me and we can have a discussion. Yeah,
Excellent.
and the social life at Post in these places is interesting too. I talked to someone in an interview at one of the embassies I was at, who said when they joined GAC from a previous career, somebody said, "Oh, welcome to the Department of Divorcees and Alcoholics." And I was like, that's pretty grim. I mean, they laughed about it, but it was sort of like, yeah, there's a lot of divorced people here. It's not that funny. I'm like, well, it's a little bit
Well,
kind of interesting that they would see themselves in that way.
when I started in the Foreign Service, the joke people told me was, okay, you can tell a male Foreign Service officer's first posting by the nationality of his spouse, and a female Foreign Service officer by where her furniture is from. And I have to say, it's sort of true. And I have like one really significant giant table that's from Nairobi, which is from Kenya, which is where my first posting was. So,
Yeah.
I guess it works. But yeah, it is, there are some interesting aspects for that. Maybe what I'll do, I will say thank you, and I will end the recording.
Sure.
Ask